About 5,000 to 7,000 years ago, a horrifying event took place, yet it is absent from any written history. No battlefields were recorded, no monuments were built, no songs were composed, and no one mourned. This catastrophe left no trace of broken bones or ruined buildings, only silence buried deep within our bodies, in our DNA, in the remnants of our ancestors' legacy. Modern genetic research has uncovered something strange. Around 90% of Y chromosome lineages, the genetic markers passed exclusively through males, completely vanished during this period. It wasn't caused by disease. It wasn't a natural disaster. It was the result of a deliberate purge, where most men had no chance to pass on their bloodline. So, what really happened in the shadows of prehistory? Why were only men erased from genetic history? Who did it and for what reason? And most importantly, how did the consequences of that purge silently reshape the very world we live in today? Chapter 2, the genetic culling. Between 5,000 and 3,000 BCE, a strange disturbance began to ripple across the genetic map of humanity. It wasn't a mutation. It wasn't the aftermath of a plague. It was something far rarer, a near total collapse in male genetic diversity, measured through the Y chromosome, which is passed only from father to son. While mitochondrial DNA inherited from mothers remained relatively rich and varied, the Y chromosome shrank in a terrifying way, to the point where only a handful of male lineages survived, slowly erasing all the rest. This was no random event. It occurred simultaneously across vast regions, from the plains of Central Europe to the steppes of Eurasia. Scientists call it a genetic bottleneck, a moment when diversity is squeezed to a minimum. But what makes this case unusual is one disturbing detail. Only men were affected. There's no evidence of a natural disaster, no trace of any known epidemic. Instead, archaeological and anthropological data point to something far darker, an organized social purge targeting males, and the survivors? Very few. Only a small handful of Y chromosome lineages endured, most notably R1A and R1B, two genetic lines that would later dominate nearly all male populations across Europe and Central Asia. But that dominance didn't emerge gradually. It happened so fast it defies natural explanation. There's only one plausible answer. Groups of men carrying these Y lineages completely wiped out their rivals, then monopolized access to women in the conquered communities. This wasn't just warfare. This was genetic warfare. It didn't merely kill people, it erased bloodlines. Women were not slaughtered. They were taken as sexual slaves, forced wives, or reproductive tools. Men from the losing side, whether boys or elders, were erased from the gene pool, either killed or denied the chance to ever reproduce. And in this way, a tiny number of bloodlines came to control the genetic future of our species. Not because they were stronger, not because they were smarter, but because they were the ones who survived a series of brutal conflicts designed to annihilate every competing lineage. And from that point on, history wasn't just written by the victors. It was encoded into their genes and passed down to us all. Chapter 3, the birth of the warrior society. From around 3000 to 2000 BCE, a cultural wave began to spread at terrifying speed across the Eurasian continent, so fast that it far exceeded the movement capabilities of prehistoric people. Three major cultures, the Yamnaya of the Pontic steppe, the corded ware of Central and Northern Europe, and the bell beaker of Western Europe, though separated by vast distances, all shared one core trait. They were warrior societies. What set them apart was not farming techniques, tools, or architecture, but a new ideology built on war, bloodline, and inherited power. They were not just farmers or traders. They were organized warriors with a clear goal to expand, control, and dominate. They carried with them symbols, rituals, and social hierarchies to define themselves not only in life, but in death. The clearest evidence lies in warrior graves. A man from the ruling class wasn't just buried with weapons, battle axes, daggers, bronze swords, but also with horses, chariots, even servants, or sacrificed women. And that wasn't all. Gold, bronze, and precious stones buried with the dead weren't mere luxuries, they were marks of power. This man once held life and death in his hands, once passed down his bloodline, and once established a legacy for the next generation. From this emerged an entirely new class, the warrior aristocracy. Unlike earlier communities, where status came from experience or contribution, now power was defined by violence, bloodline, and the ability to pass on that bloodline through sons. Not everyone could be a leader. Only those born into the right bloodline had the right to rule. The ruling class was no longer just skilled warriors. They were men who could prove their lineage. Father was a warrior. Grandfather was a warrior. Son would be a warrior. This was no longer a flexible society. It was a closed system where everything honor, wealth, and genetic legacy was held tightly by a small elite, monopolizing both life and blood. And the scariest part is, this society wasn't accidental. It was deliberately constructed, justified through ritual, mythology, and symbolism, designed to preserve power across generations without question. Male honor from this point on was no longer defined by winning a duel, but by preserving the bloodline, producing heirs, and leaving behind an immortal legacy buried with their grave. And from here, a powerful cultural archetype was born, one that would never truly die. The warrior man, the powerful father, the founder of a bloodline. They didn't just shape their own societies. They left an indelible mark on mythology, psychology, and the structure of the family even to this very day. Chapter 4: Warfare, Power, and Patriarchy. The rise of male-dominated rule. Before the 4th millennium BCE, war, if it even existed, was mostly small-scale skirmishes. Hunter-gatherer groups clashed over water, hunting grounds, or simply because of accidental territorial overlap. But around 4000 BCE, the very nature of warfare began to change completely, from an instinctive reaction to an organized strategy, from a struggle for survival to a tool for reshaping the genetic future. As agriculture advanced, humans, for the first time, had fixed settlements, accumulated property, and surplus resources, including manpower. And with that, war became more attractive and more feasible than ever before. No longer just about raiding, the goal now was to erase rival bloodlines from the future. Archaeological evidence leaves little room for a softer explanation. Sites like Talheim, Germany, Herxheim, France, and Aspern-Schletz, Austria, all reveal mass killings from the same period. The pattern is chillingly consistent. Men were slaughtered. Women and young girls were spared. This wasn't tribal squabbling. This was a deliberate genetic campaign. Kill the men and wipe their DNA from history. This pattern repeated across regions. A group of men, often related by blood, formed a warrior alliance. They attacked, overpowered another community, then forced the women to bear their children. The result? The next generation carried the Y chromosomes of the victors alone. Not only were rivals defeated on the battlefield, they were erased from the human genome. And from this, the first patriarchal systems were born. What was once a communal society where people shared and cooperated now became a hierarchy where power concentrated in the hands of men, and more specifically, certain men. Those who could lead, fight, and pass down their bloodline through sons. The patriarch was no longer just the eldest male. He became the center of authority, of legacy, and of reproduction. Under this model, reproductive rights became political privilege. Whoever won the war didn't just take land, he decided who had the biological right to exist in the next generation. Only the bloodlines allowed to reproduce would appear in the future. Gradually, this system fused family, kinship, power, property, and genetic survival into a single unified structure, and everything was placed under the control of powerful men. From that point forward, the family itself became the next battlefield, a space where honor, inheritance, and bloodline were no longer personal matters, but tools for preserving power across generations. Chapter 5, Myth of a Violent Golden Age. The bloody legend we still worship. Thousands of years have passed, yet the memory of that bloody age did not vanish. It transformed into myth, not careful history, but legend, poetry, epic tales. And strangely, almost every major civilization revered a so-called golden age of violence, a time when men who killed without mercy were hailed as heroes. They weren't condemned, they were worshipped. In Greece, there was Heracles, slayer of lions, hydras, and monsters, but also a man who murdered his wife and children in madness and was still called great. There was Achilles, who slaughtered the Trojans without pity, or Perseus, who killed Medusa and forcibly claimed Andromeda. In all these stories, violence was cloaked in glory, and men stood at the irreplaceable center. In Norse mythology, we find Odin, the god who gouged out his own eye to gain wisdom. Thor, the warrior who smashed enemies with his hammer. Valhalla, the hall where fallen warriors were granted immortality if they died in battle. Death was no longer feared. It became the highest honor, as long as it came through righteous bloodshed. In India, the epic tales of Mahabharata and Ramayana told of civil wars between brothers, where hundreds of thousands died over honor, vows, and destiny. Though rich in philosophy, the core message remained: male power in war were the driving forces of the universe. So then, what were these myths, really? If not distorted memories, retold from the perspective of the survivors? No one wrote about the nameless men who were slaughtered. No one recorded the women turned into reproductive tools. No one told the story of the bloodlines erased from history, because only the survivors could tell stories, and they told them to justify their own existence. Myth became the perfect tool to legitimize violence, to turn invaders into heroes, to turn massacres into missions, to turn the suffering of the defeated into silence. Myth does not reflect truth. It reflects what society wants to believe, to preserve, and to pass on. And in a bitter irony, the collective memory of a prehistoric genocide, instead of being seen as tragedy, became a symbol of masculine ideals, natural order, and male glory. We did not only inherit our ancestors' genes, we inherited the way they told history, in the most favorable way to themselves. And perhaps the deepest question is this: what we celebrate today may simply be the memory of blood and tears, dressed in the shining mask of myth, a myth told by the one who held the weapon, so no one would ever ask, who died to make this myth possible? Chapter 6, The Long Shadow, the ancient weight that still presses on us. We often think that what happened 7,000 years ago belongs only to archaeology and history, a strange world, long dead and buried beneath layers of stone. But the truth is, we are still living with the consequences of that age. Look around, the way our society is structured, the way we assign roles, the way we pass things down, all still carry the imprint of a time when survival depended on violence and bloodline selection. We inherit our father's name, not our mother's. It may sound simple, but is a clear sign of a patriarchal society, one where only the male bloodline is considered worth remembering. Wealth, honor, power, most are still passed from father to son. Even though modern society has changed in many ways, in countless parts of the world, those laws haven't disappeared. They've merely changed form. Even the very idea of masculinity, strength, control, dominance, emotional suppression, isn't rooted in biology. It is the legacy of an ancient warrior system where survival meant eliminating the other. And women, they are still often judged by their ability to bear children, to nurture, to submit, roles not designed by nature, but by a power structure that needed to preserve ownership through blood. These invisible beliefs, still embedded in our cultural DNA, are ghosts from a forgotten age. And here's the frightening truth. None of this is natural. We were not born to obey patriarchal order. We were not born to believe that the strong should rule and the weak should vanish. These are just the results of thousands of years of society built on violence and genetic selection. And the saddest part is, we may not be inheriting the best parts of humanity, only what managed to survive the bloodshed. What remains is not always what is right. What is passed down is not always what should be kept. If we never stop to question, never trace the origins of the values our world holds sacred, then we may unconsciously be repeating the patterns of the survivors, not acting as a species with intelligence and choice. That nameless genocide didn't just kill bodies. It left a deep psychological scar in the structure of human society, one we have yet to escape. And only by daring to face it can we finally step out from its long shadow. So we no longer repeat the mistakes passed down as if they were destiny. This video isn't just about genetics, archaeology, or mythology. It's a wake-up call. Human history isn't just made of what was preserved. It's also shaped by what was erased, distorted, or retold from the perspective of the victors. There's a very real chance that your ancestors, our ancestors, were once part of the 90% of men erased from history. Not because they were weak, but because they didn't belong to the violent system that took over. Perhaps they once lived in smaller communities, built on mutual respect, on cooperation instead of domination. But that way of life didn't survive the storm of weapons, warfare, and power. We cannot change the past, but we can choose how we understand it and how we move forward. To understand so we don't repeat it, to face it so we're no longer manipulated by it, and most importantly, to stop the past from haunting our future in silence. If you want to keep digging into the forgotten layers of our history, to uncover the stories that were never told, subscribe to this channel now. Because history doesn't only belong to the strong, it also echoes in the faint voices of those who never got to speak.